Happy 4th of July, everyone. This is it. As you guys can see on the bottom, episode 10, the season 1 finale of Talkin Thrones. Pat, we finally made it here. 10 episodes in, man. You got any words to say before we get this show on the road?
Yeah, I think the talking TV audience can agree with me that this is more like, blood than fire, blood and fire, because we see the blood first,
Yeah.
what I mean,
Yeah,
right?
I get
Right.
it. All of that and more. Stay tuned. All right, people, so we're pre-recording this, obviously, for the 4th of July. Famously, this is the only episode so far of the show that is not live, but it would be awesome if you guys could still comment, nonetheless, and give us your thoughts. Obviously, Pat, we made it. A full season of this show.
If you're watching this, on the night of the 4th of July, that sword at the beginning of this episode with all the blood dripping off of it, that's my knife with all the, pork ribs and stuff that I'm barbecuing.
Dude, it's ridiculous. Like King's Landing was getting ready to throw their own 4th of July. Like, the way that, they were celebrating Ned Stark's death, it was almost like that should have been declared a national holiday as far as that goes.
Yeah, so, hey, thank you for tuning in and watching this pre-recorded episode. Like, we're definitely doing it because the holiday just lands on that day. But
Yes.
we are excited, because this is the final episode of season 1. And, hey, it's what I've been saying all along. Like, season 1, essentially, a lot of setup, a lot of,
of setup.
things that we have to sort of watch and understand and digest and, before the exciting things happen. But, what happens is right here in the season 9, or episode 9, episode 10 combo, you basically get the formula that's going to continue throughout the rest of the series. And that's big events happen in episode 9. And then basically episode 10 is a lot of setup for the next season and give you a lot of time between the seasons to start thinking about and digesting and getting prepared for what's going to happen next. And I think this changes the flow between season 1 and season 2. Season 2 seems definitely a lot tighter and gets right into the action and really is a great ride from start to finish. Whereas like season 1, there's a couple things that are like predictable, a couple things that are like, oh, come on, get to the point already. There's a lot of hurry up and wait type moments before, in my opinion, it starts getting good. So, with that sort of said, what is some of the elements that are really brought into play here, setting us up for season 2, Dom?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of bounce off your point, first off, though, this definitely, you're right, sets the precedent of, okay, so episode 9 is the big event, episode 10 is kind of fallout, reshuffle, reset for the next season, and we see that all throughout this episode. We see that, obviously, with Arya, and where she's being spirited off to next. This sets up Sansa for the next couple of seasons, obviously, right? We see kind of the effects, right, of, again, I've talked about this before on this podcast, which is that part of the power of Game of Thrones is this idea of having this one event that you can see just the ripple effects of it throughout the entirety of the event. And if I can sling one thing this episode's praise, specifically with this finale, it's that I think that it does a masterful job of kind of handling and having Ned Stark's death be the ripple effect that's going to set us up for the next couple of seasons, really. Obviously, Robb being crowned king in the north, right? Jon obviously has a big decision to make, obviously, now that, given his current allegiance, he has a big moment to go through, right? And then we'll also have Tyrion going on the rest of his journey that's going to set him up for the rest of the show, and Dany as well. And I think that kind of the elements and what this sets up for season 2 is it shows that a lot of shit is about to hit the fan. Yes, this season had a lot of plotting, but it was well worth it because there was a lot of shit that they had to set up. And the thing that always impresses me about season 1 as a whole is, for a season that is primarily set up, you're right. It was a completely different experience for me watching the first couple of episodes week to week as opposed to binging it all at once, because I didn't start watching this show week to week basis until season 4, which came out my junior year of high school. So kind of the first 3 seasons, I've always had this experience of just binging it first and foremost. And so this was kind of really the first time where I was able to step back and kind of see and experience it the way that everyone else did when this show first came out. And it definitely gave me a different perspective on both this season and kind of overall the show, right? Because that's kind of part of the whole point of this podcast is kind of supposed to answer the question kind of what went wrong with later on in this season. And for me, like, all the seeds among many, many other things are found in this initial season right here.
Yeah, I sort of had a different experience. Like, I binge watched season 1, and then season 2, basically, I started having like once a week dinner parties with friends during each, like, other season. And we basically, every week, it was Game of Thrones night, and we enjoyed dinner, and we watched the episode, and we had a great conversation about it. And I feel like that sort of water cooler feel is one of the big successes to this show. It's like every week you had to sort of talk with your friends, and whether or not it was like you watching it Sunday night and then going in to work or school or whatever you were up to, you were sort of talking about it with the people that you knew watched the show. And in our sort of friend circle, we basically most of the weeks, maybe we missed some here and there, and definitely towards the later seasons when they took a little more gaps to release those seasons, the dinner parties got like longer and longer apart. But for the most part, it was sort of like a big social experience to watch it week to week. So like this show was, definitely season 1 was getting everybody hyped and getting everybody on board. And then the other seasons, once people were on board, it was like, yeah, like we got to talk about this. We got to watch this, together or whatever it may be, relatively in the same amount of time so we can talk about it. So I think that's a cool aspect of the show. In terms of your point about ripple effects and like how things for the whole show sort of ripple out from Ned Stark's death, it's one of those things. It's how he fails to play the game where things start to ripple out, because Renly basically says, hey, swear with me and, I'll be king and we'll basically make sure that we put an end to the Lannisters. And if Ned sort of, did that and sort of ignored the fact that Stannis was the rightful heir, you're talking about, that would be it. There would be no war.
Yeah.
The fact is, the choices Ned had to sort of end this war were not the honorable ones. And it spurred, separate claims to the throne, because you're going to have Stannis and Renly. You're going to have, who else becomes a claimant to the throne? Like you have Joffrey, obviously, who's on the
Robb,
throne.
who just wants to independence for the North, which
Yeah,
is established in
exactly.
this episode. And then later on in season 2, we get a 5th claim, which is when it officially becomes the War of the Five Kings with Balon Greyjoy, Theon's father.
Yeah, so it's like everybody is sort of breaking apart and the realm's starting to fall apart, and it's descending into war. And I think this goes to a big point earlier in the season that Robert, Baratheon makes, where it's not about the realm, more or less. It's basically about these squabbles and personal gains, and everybody's sort of out for themselves. And it's not about sort of making sure the kingdoms work together and in harmony. And, he sort of predicts and foreshadows this, falling apart of the kingdoms. And, it's one of those things that's very interesting. It's like, he doesn't do anything to really stop it. He sort of just continues to drink wine and be led down that path. He allows himself to get completely surrounded by the Lannisters, but he can see the writing on the wall that, he's not going to really survive. He's sort of, just enjoying his kingdom while it lasts. And then he doesn't really put any credence to what's going to come afterwards, other than really worried about Daenerys and making sure that she doesn't live, which is a very odd, thing that's the thing he harps on. But he really doesn't do much to, sort of prevent any of this fracturing that happens as soon as his death occurs.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of how Robert is, again, it's one of the most said things about him was that he was a much better battle commander than he was a king. And It shows clearly because he was perfectly willing to let the realms fall apart, even though he knew kind of what was coming, essentially. And kind of the whole focus, right, is kind of, setting up, I feel like, the precedent for our season finales going forward, right? Obviously, the Game of Thrones have their season finales, but we're going to have our season finales here on Talkin Thrones. And so my whole thing is that I want to kind of break down kind of where each of the major characters, at least presented in this episode, kind of wrap up and where that sets them going forward for this next season. So,
Well, I'm going to just jump in there with my favorite one, and that's Joffrey, right? Because, doesn't he have a singer come into his court and like sing this terrible song, and then Joffrey basically sets off to mutilate him?
yeah, it's this very distasteful song kind of about King Robert's death. And just like how and it's just yet another example. This guy is being set up for failure. It's the poor singer from earlier on in the season when Cat was taking Tyrion to the Vale, basically just showing how it's like, oh yeah, Robert died and it's all a big joke. And it's just another example to show off Joffrey's cruelty. He beratedly shows off all of the heads of the deceased Stark men to Sansa, showing her the heads of her father and Septim Ordain. And
Exactly. It's bringing in like the sadistic element of Joffrey. Like, he's proud of these pikes and the heads on them, and he's threatening sort of this, low level magician or musician.
Yeah.
I guess magic tricks would be pretty cool at this
Yeah, it
point.
would be.
But, for the most part, it's one of those things where, after riding the high of Ned Stark's death, Joffrey has this confidence that he can sort of be this sadistic king, and we're going to see that side of him grow, over the course of season 2. And I think these particular, scenes, one with the musician and the other with Sansa, and making sure that she basically is deflated and defeated, seeing sort of the triumph, his bloody triumph over her family, and basically saying that, hey, this is going to be what I do to your brother Robb. It's one of those things where we understand that Joffrey's not quite right, in the head. Like, there's something sadistic about him, something where, like I said last week in episodes 9 when we were talking about it, Joffrey doesn't really know how to play the Game of Thrones. He's just sort of, drunk with the idea that he's king, and he wants to present himself as a strong king, and he thinks a strong king is basically a sadistic king. And that's, two separate things. Like, a strong king is not necessarily sharing the qualities of a sadistic king. But Joffrey doesn't really understand that. He's not intelligent enough at this point in his life to fully understand that.
Let me ask you something. So there's a moment, a very obvious moment, where Sansa obviously makes a crack at Joffrey about Robb bringing her Joffrey's head, instead of Joffrey serving her Robb's head. And obviously Joffrey famously has, one of his Kingsguard members, Ser Meryn, who seems all too eager to want to just manhandle Sansa, just does a number on her. And then she has this really interesting moment where she has a chance to like kind of push him off the balcony, almost at the risk of her own life, but the Hound steps in and stops her, right? The Hound, who really isn't that much of a character this season, he's kind of just a glorified bodyguard who ends up getting more development as, the show went on. Obviously, he, eventually when he leaves King's Landing and leaves Joffrey's service and everything. But I definitely think that, I don't know, what do you think would have happened if Sansa had perchance gone through with that and actually killed Joffrey there?
Well, I think the thing here is first, Joffrey refusing to hit Sansa. Like, it's one of those things where, strangely enough, this is like one of the first things of advice from Cersei that he takes. Never strike your queen. And so he basically gets around that by saying, hey, go ahead and slap Sansa around for me. And so it's strange that he's really saying that he's going to respect Cersei, but by disregarding her and getting around it by some sort of, oh, my guard did it for me. And so it's almost like he doesn't really care about the rules. He doesn't respect even the family that's supposed to guide him. And, it's sort of setting up that he's not going to be this great king. And with Sansa, sort of understanding that he's a sadistic person and having a lot of that, like, really grief that's going on inside her, and it's starting to manifest as hate towards Joffrey, and probably a few other people in the realm. Like if she goes ahead and pushes him off there, he probably would have died, Joffrey. But ultimately, I think what would have happened is Cersei would have basically punished her in terms of, either death, which I think would be too easy because, the whole idea that we need the Starks alive as bargaining chips. So I don't necessarily think that she would have been killed in retaliation. But I think she would have been tortured or in some regards, maybe mutilated, some weird punishment that would keep her alive. But at the same time, she wouldn't really want to live after whatever said torture or whatnot is. So I think when the Hound steps in and kind of stops her and says, "You're going to regret that," or sort of hints towards that, I think he's really preventing her from potential years, because we have no idea how long this war is going to be. It could be years of sort of imprisonment or torture or whatever is done to her, humiliation. That's some of the stuff. It's like, those are going to be the worst years of your life if, you go through with this. And I think that's really what the Hound is doing, protecting her. And it's really setting up like, where this goes in season 2, whose allies, or who does Sansa have as an ally in season 2? It's really nobody. But ultimately, she's going to have the Hound as a potential ally, not just like a bodyguard in Joffrey's court, but someone that she might actually have some conversations with and get some deep understanding about the situation that she's in.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Arya for a second. So this episode, Arya only has 2 major sequences, right? It opens with her with Yoren spiriting her away from the capital, kind of, from the mainstay of Ned's carnage. And obviously, he keeps calling her boy over and over again, and then cuts her hair in his show of display. That kind of shows, okay, yeah, he's bringing her back to Winterfell, but he knows that she's going to be wanted. So she kind of has to undergo this kind of this new look in order to kind of protect her identity. And this kind of sets up Arya for this kind of inevitable journey where, even though she definitely doesn't undergo death the way that her father and her mother and her brother do, she kind of undergoes kind of like her own self-inflicted Stark torture where, Sansa is stuck in King's Landing having to, do Joffrey's every forced to endure Joffrey's bidding and torture. And this sets Arya up for kind of this whole thing is where it seems like every single time Arya's this close to getting what it is that she wants, it gets snatched from her, right? End of season 2, she makes a terrible decision by not having a faceless man that she has pretty much in her service kill Tywin Lannister and effectively ending the war right there. And then she ends up in season 3 getting this close to being reunited with Robb, and then the Red Wedding happens. And then by the time we get to season 4, she's like kind of, screw this, I'm going to like kind of do my own thing. And we kind of see where that leads her. But it's interesting, I think, Arya's struggle, because Arya was always a character that it definitely felt like long-term, we didn't exactly know how that was going to work out, right? Because the whole thing of where she ends, her arc ends in the books, right, is, I would say, right at like the cutoff point, like right in the first couple episodes of season 6 when she gets her eyesight back for the first time. That's kind of where Arya leaves, but we really have no indication of where that goes from here on out. So, like, what's kind of your take on that as far as where Arya's arc goes for the rest of the show?
Well, the interesting thing, what we know right now in episode 10, of season 1 and getting set up for season 2 is that she's traumatized, but she doesn't have time to deal with that, right? It's basically pull you to the side, cut your hair. You're a boy now. You're part of the Night's Watch. Let's go. And essentially, later in the episode, we sort of understand who else is part of the Night's Watch, and it's Gendry. Robert Baratheon's bastard son that basically worked at the blacksmith's shop. So for the most part, we understand that the two of them are on the run. There's a couple other characters that are introduced in this sort of Night's Watch march back up to the wall. But for the most part, it's like Arya fleeing for her life, traumatized, not having time to process this, and, what's going to happen. And essentially, the fact that she's traveling with Gendry is going to be interesting. Like, do the two of do the two share, why they're on the run? Do they become allies? Do they sort of, keep it hidden from each other? It's sort of like this, what's going to happen when the two of them get put together and, they're put on this trip to get away from King's Landing.
Yes. I think obviously the idea to pair Arya up with Gendry kind of always worked out in hindsight, right? The fact that they're both kind of outcast, they're both kind of the black sheep, respectively, of their families, so it makes sense, obviously, that they would kind of have this connection, right? And obviously we see how that becomes, no pun intended, but bastardized in the later seasons with that whatever the fuck that sex scene was in episode 2, where it's basically just showing, hey, Arya's all grown up now, and it's like, oh yeah, because we definitely needed to see that. But I definitely think that there's kind of some merit to that point of Arya is traumatized beyond belief, but she kind of doesn't have time to deal with it. And she kind of shuffled.
I think Arya, right, it's one of those things like the traumatized and not time to process. Like, at some point she does process it and she realizes that she has had experiences well beyond her years. And so, I can understand your issue with the sort of,
weird
probably,
sex scene
I would say most audience members would probably agree with you that it was kind of an unnecessary sex scene.
It's just the way it was filmed. That's all it was. It's the way it was filmed, and it's kind of its inclusion there as far as that goes.
But I think it's one of those things where, like, because of the trauma, because of what she's been forced to do, run away, flee for her life, not really deal with her father being murdered, in such a way, and being separated from her family, even like Yoren, what happens to him in season 2, and sort of them getting captured again, and
right after, especially because Yoren's the one who gives her the idea for the list, like the list of names that she recites to herself of people that she's gonna kill. As far as that goes, Yoren's the one who gives the idea to her.
It's almost like she regains a father figure, and you could for a moment think like, she's gonna go to the wall and become part of the Watch just to hide. Maybe they don't go to Winterfell because the heat's too hot. Like. Either she gets back home, or like, her and Yoren have this sort of like spin-off where they're doing adventures beyond the wall. I don't know, whatever. But there's hope there, that she finally has someone that understands the pain she's going through and can work through that. And that's what we have to look forward in season 2.
And the
but
other
I think it ages her when another traumatic thing happens and another thing happens, and it's one of those things where that particular scene makes sense, that she's ready to explore more adult things, at even a young age. So it's very interesting. Maybe I agree with you, it might not have been handled 100%, but we're talking about Jason Momoa and the witch, and man. Daenerys not being handled properly. There's a couple things.
We'll get to that in the focus character segment. But I wanted to real quick just touch on Robb and Cap, because even though Robb doesn't have that much screen time in this episode, it's two monumental. It's a monumental sequence that happens. Obviously, with him being crowned king in the North. Obviously, we know that the doom this kind of sets him up on. Right. I always wonder this. Right. Which is the idea of, okay, so. They know, obviously, that their only course of action in order to deal with the Lannisters is to team up with either Stannis or Renly. And their whole thing is they're debating whether to declare for which Baratheon brother as far as that goes. And then, obviously, Great John Umber comes up with the idea to crown Robb the king in the North. And even though we know how that ends for Robb, it kind of just sets up this kind of micro struggle that the Starks in and of themselves have going for them, where Sansa even brings this up in the finale, which is that they kind of like struggle to strive for this independence from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. And it kind of makes sense logistically, because the North is so massive. The North in and of itself is bigger than the other Seven Kingdoms, like, combined. So it makes sense for, like, the North to have this independence, right? And the whole thing is that, going all the way back to that first episode, right, with Torrhen Stark, the last king who knelt, obviously, to the Targaryens, Great John Umber brings that back, which is that it was the dragons who we knelt to, and now it's the dragons, And now the dragons are all gone. I'm wondering, is this like yet another like of the Starks' infinite blunders that happened throughout the season to declare themselves as independent rather than declare for one of the Baratheon brothers? Because even though they do this move, they still ultimately Robb does send Catelyn south in order to try and negotiate with Renly and perchance with Stannis in order to try and engage some sort of alliance, and he sends Theon away to his father. And we obviously see how that turns out as far as that goes. But I don't know. Like, do you think that that was the right decision, crowning themselves independent?
You know, in my point of view, I think it is the right decision because, you know, for the most part, I never get the sense that the combined kingdoms is sustainable, right? You know, it's, you know, Robert says himself that there's always sort of this like struggle amongst them. And, you know, it just seems like it's everyone's going for petty wants and desires and whatnot. And because the North has sort of this sense of duty, sense of honor, you know, having them as independent, ruling themselves, really kind of reclusive and not getting involved in too many sort of, you know, games of thrones, so to speak. Like they're just sort of like a peaceful, out of the way kingdom. They don't want to deal with this treachery. And, you know, I think that's going to be separating themselves and being a separate kingdom. And, you know, really, they're sort of the ideal kingdom that the entire, you know, combined kingdoms could never be. You know, it's sort of like they do get along in such a way where it's like honor is important. Although that gets chipped away, you know, as like Ned is now dead.
Yeah, and then once we bring the Boltons into the picture, and once the Greyjoy invasion of the North happens, and people start to question Robb, and then the Karstark obviously leaving them, and you know, between a rock and a hard place in season 3, which forces them to try to appeal to the phrase. It's
yeah. So I think there's a lot of fracturing that happens because, you know, the Lannisters are really fighting an aggressive war to control all the kingdoms. And, you know, they're doing it through sort of schemes and through betrayals and through offering territories and power and all that type of stuff that sort of, you know, Robert was preaching against in the first season before his death. And for the most part, that is brought to the North. And that's really what they're fighting is, you know, we need honor, we need respect. That's really what creates a stable environment. And, you know, they think they can do it independently and, you know, separate themselves from what's going on in the rest of the kingdoms. And I think teaming up with, you know, Renly is sort of trying to undo the mistake that Ned made, not teaming up with him in the first place. You know, get the overwhelming numbers, control the crown, basically bring it back to that stable point. But, you know, what happens between Stannis and Renly sort of prevents that from happening and really tumbles this further out of control as we go through season 2. So it's one of those things where, you know, even though the North, right, by declaring Robb the King of the North and sort of them trying to correct the mistakes that Ned made, it's still not enough because the pieces have been set in motion to prevent that. So it's a very interesting thing that you phrase of like, was it a good thing for them to do? And I think, you know, I think yes, I think it's ultimately what they had to do. You know, because they had to sort of try to play this referee, try to bring honor back to the kingdoms, and, you know, try to correct the mistakes that Ned unfortunately made. And it's sort of like in hindsight, and they almost attain it, as we'll see in season 2. But, you know, it basically does fall apart, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, the only other kind of major scene that came from this, obviously, is Kat's first of many interrogations of Jaime, obviously, where Jaime just kind of admits to pushing Bran out the window, then Kat hits him with the rock, and then says that he's going to be a worst of 7 hells, And then Jamie kind of makes this proclamation about the gods and if they're so just, and why is the world so full of cruel men? And then he does the infinite whole thing of the Loki thing of, oh, there are no men like me. And then he does this really interesting line where he says, oh, sleep well, it's going to be a long war, which is kind of foretelling and isn't, because the war, I feel like, doesn't go on for as long as we think it does, right? Because as Tyrion brings up in a couple of seasons, obviously kings start dying like flies, first with Renly, then with Joffrey, then with Robb, then later on, even though he dies much later than he's supposed to in the books, but Balon Greyjoy, and kind of Stannis is the only one left standing kind of by default, but it still doesn't necessarily make him king. So that's more so stuff that we can get into as far as, once we hit season 2, but I thought that was just another interesting line that was very foretelling. But
well, even the war amongst the Lannister clan, that basically heats things up too, because the amount of Lannisters that sit on the throne throughout the course of the series
it's ridiculous.
It is nuts. It's like everyone pretty much has a turn except for Tywin.
Yeah,
pretty
much.
That's
and
not
then
true, but there's
dead.
a couple others.
It's like everyone has a turn, and if they don't have a turn, then they end up dead. So that's pretty much how the show goes ultimately.
Yeah.
But speaking of honor, let's talk real quick about Jon. Jon, again, kind of wraps up his arc. Again, it's very minimalistic. This arc was primarily set up for him throughout the show. But the thing that becomes immediately apparent here is Jon officially makes his decision. He is officially putting his foot down and saying, okay, I have this opportunity to go south. It's the wrong decision, obviously, because I know what happens to deserters, but I don't care in the moment because at first he's acting rationally. Then his brothers go, and they bring him, Sam, Gren, and Pip, obviously bring him back by reciting the Night's Watch vows, and then he appears with the Lord Commander. The Lord Commander kind of gives him the spiel about honor bringing him back, but it not being his honor, and then saying that, you need to make this decision. Are you going to be a bastard boy trying to play a war? Or are you a man of the Night's Watch? Before he announces that he's kind of leading this large expedition north in order to try and find out what happened to Benjen Stark and all the other Rangers that went missing north of the Wall, and figure out what's going on with the wildlings and the rumors about the dead and everything. And his whole thing is, it's like, look, he's kind of reinforcing that idea that Jon buys into, at least for the first part of his arc for like the next couple seasons, which is that ultimately, as is revealed within the opening scene of this season, is that ultimately the fighting and all the squabbling between the men of the Seven Kingdoms, kind of echoing Robert's sentiments, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the dead are coming, and when the dead come, it's not going to matter who sits on the Iron Throne, And that's kind of established right here and then, because Jon, even though he's very still enmeshed in emotion as far as that goes, he does understand that, like, look, there is something that is greater. And even though the Night's Watch is kind of gone down in his eyes as far as what he thought it was versus what it actually is, he does understand that at the end of the day, they do have a greater role to play. And they do kind of serve, ultimately, this higher cause. So it kind of goes into that whole honor statement with Robb, right? Where the North is kind of trying to fight to preserve that honor that is so missing from the remaining Seven Kingdoms. But they're ultimately fighting, not just for honor, but quite literally they're fighting for life and death. And it's obviously something that becomes a major focus in the last couple of seasons. But I don't know. Do you think this accurately reflects the kind of the pinnacle, the wrap up of Jon's arc, especially after that awesome moment in the last episode with Maester Aemon?
Well, I think, again, I said this, for episode 9 when we were talking about it last week. And for the most part, it's Jon, is still learning. He's still young. He's sort of still got that blood in his fire in his blood, so to speak, to bring up the name of the episode. Like, he's ready to rush, off, throw the vows away. Who cares about the oath? Let me go join this war. Let me go avenge Ned Stark's death. And it's one of those things where, he's been taught about honor and what it means to uphold an oath, but he's never really had to do it. And so, he's really ready to rush into something else and not really know what it really means to stick with something. And, his friends, that he is sort of bound to remind him. And, Mormont reminds him. And it's one of those things where, the Lord Commander Mormont, it becomes basically his father. Like, Ned could never really be his father, even though he was, right? He was the bastard son, but, he really...
As we find out later, not so much, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But, like, he never really was able to, other than, like, the fact that he lived in Winterfell, and he sort of, he got to grow up with Robb and Bran and Sansa and Arya and like be a part of the family. He never really got that direct father bond, or at least not to the same impact that that some of the other Starks got. But it's one of those things like with being, forced to sort of go to the wall and separate from Ned. It's like he needs a father figure. He doesn't have it. And the Lord Commander sort of becomes that and actually finishes the lesson that Ned set up about oath keeping and honor. And that's something that the Lord Commander is going to continue teaching Jon throughout the second season. And so I think it's one of those things where we're showing the parallel between Ned and the Lord Commander as honorable people that exist in this world. And it's now that Ned's gone, it's really like those lessons that Ned sort of taught him growing up. It's now time to act on those. And this is really the first test, right? Him leaving and being brought back by his friends. He's learning the bonds of friendship. And then, Mormont tells him really what happened and sort of says it in such a way that he can digest it and fully understand what he has to do going forward. And I think this is when Jon really starts being a man and starts, or at least he starts becoming a man of Winterfell and understanding that, honor is all you have. And, because he swore this oath, that's the only way that he can earn that honor, throughout the kingdoms.
I find it interesting because this sequence, along with one other sequence in this finale that I'm currently forgetting about, were actually not in the original book of Game of Thrones. They were actually from the chapters that were from the beginning of Book 2, A Clash of Kings, that they ended up adding to this season. I remember now. It was this scene and the scene where Arya meets Hot Pie and Gendry. Both of those two sequences were things that were originally from Book 2, A Clash of Kings, that were added on to the end of the season. And honestly, it works way better because you kind of get to see the wrap-up and the finality of both Arya and Jon's respective arcs and kind of where that's going to set them up on their journey going forward. And you're right, definitely. Like, Jon definitely finds a father figure in the Lord Commander that he never really had before. And it definitely, I feel like, kind of sets him up as far as, okay, so now that he has this new father figure, he wants to impress him. And that's kind of what sets him up for, like, when he goes on his journey with the wildlings and kind of in a weird way steers him towards this direction of almost becoming this leader without even realizing it. Because that's the whole thing. That's the whole interest behind Jon's arc, is that Jon starts off as somebody who is not going to be inheriting anything and ends up essentially being revealed not only to kind of like end up being this savior figure to the wildlings as time goes on, and the savior of the whole realm, as he's the only one that's really shepherding and pushing the idea of, okay, the dead are coming, the dead are coming, the dead are coming. But he's also revealed to be the heir apparent when his Targaryen heritage is revealed, obviously, making him like a direct opposition to Daenerys, obviously. So I find it really interesting how all of those seeds, even though like they don't necessarily come up until later on, they can still be found here. As far as, again, he starts off this show lost, and even though he's a part of this great house, he feels very isolated, very alone, very confused. He kind of just wants to act out. I made a couple jokes earlier in the season about him kind of being this season being his emo phase, kind of, but he ultimately does. He forms some camaraderie. He finds his family that he really never had, and it ultimately teaches him not only with what being a man is, but like what being a part of something is. And I feel like that's ultimately what influences his decision the most, as far as deciding to, okay, I'm here, I'm with the Night's Watch, this is my purpose now, I have to leave all that stuff, like, behind, and because this is our trek forward now, as far as that goes. So, yeah, and I think it's ironic also that he ends this season with committing to something, and then he ends the show with literally saying, fuck all, I'm just going to go and chill north of the wall with the wildlings.
Yeah, but I think one of the things is that, he starts at rock bottom. He doesn't know his place in the world, and that's eating at him. And even though, like, he is sort of in the Stark's home of Winterfell and he has privileges and whatnot, he's always the bastard, right? He's always on the outside. And so, he goes to the Night's Watch, he says the oath, like, whether it's he's expected to do that or it's just a way of him finding himself, he's sort of thrust into that experience, and he has to kind of grow and learn from it and really go from the bottom, like a nobody bastard, who is basically a steward at the wall, and he has to become a leader. He has to build his friendships, build his like sort of ability to lead and command, and really be able to, you know, fulfill the honor that is required to fight back the White Walkers. And so, you know, he's really starting from nothing and building himself up as a really strong character for the future. And that's sort of paralleling Daenerys' story, where she's sort of sold into marriage, you know, and is just sort of like Khal Drogo's plaything, and then, you know, turns into sort of this great Khaleesi, the mother of dragons, you know, the freer of slaves, like every other title that she gets.
Breaker of
Basically,
chains.
yeah, she's starting from ground zero and building herself up in different ways. And, you know, towards the end of the series, we get to see how the two of them interact in their fully adult, like, strong leader type roles. And so it's really, that's, I think, the sort of linchpin of this entire show is, you know, setting these characters up from ground zero and showing the audience how they grow in this sort of world of all this terrible stuff that's going on. And, you know, it's basically, you know, how do they deal with what's going on? How do they restore peace? How do they build some sort of bounce in the world? And, you know, the answer is just let Tyrion decide.
Yeah, pretty much.
Even though he's a prisoner.
I feel like that's a great transition into our next character that we're touching on, kind of, you know, the wrap up of all the arcs for the season, which is Tyrion, obviously. But real quick before we did that, so this episode, I haven't done this in a couple episodes, but the last episode and this episode were both directed by Alan Taylor, who is a guy who has directed a lot of episodes of some of the best TV shows ever, right? This is famous. I believe, I gotta check, but I believe that he actually may have directed the most amount of episodes. He directed 7 episodes throughout the entirety of the show. He directed the final 2 episodes, obviously, of season 1, the first 2 episodes of season 2, episodes 8 and 10, the finale. So he directed actually 2 season finales for season 2, and then he came back in season 7, obviously, in order to direct the penultimate episode, Beyond the Wall, famously, that episode where they go, you know, beyond the wall in order to get a White Walker, in order to prove that, oh yeah, the dead exist. And it's like, okay, you couldn't have done that when you were up, like, north of the wall, like, the last 15 times, but whatever. We're not.
Yeah, they can't post it on
yet.
Instagram, Dom, but, like,
yeah, I know,
you know, for the most part.
Yeah, I know, and who knows how long Ravens take to get there. But I
Yeah.
like this idea that kind of, you know, all of his episodes that he directs, he kind of captures the characters at, like, these very pivotal moments in their journeys. Obviously, famously, he directed the episode The Prince of Winterfell, which is the 8th episode of season 2, which is kind of the build-up, right, to the Blackwater battle that takes up all of episode 9, which is where he's kind of doing this interesting thing with playing around with Theon, where he finds Theon at this big crux in his journey before Theon ultimately has to make a decision 2 episodes from then. And it's the same kind of in Beyond the Wall, even though that's more of an action-paced episode. But I think Alan Taylor's a really good guy when it comes to, like, capturing characters at these very crucial moments. He did the same thing, actually, way back when in The Sopranos, because so famously he only directed 1 episode for The Sopranos first season, and then left for a couple seasons. Then he came back in season 4 to direct the episode The Strong Silent Type, which is the episode where Tony and the rest of the gangsters were having to confront Christopher about his drug addiction, and they have this awesome kind of intervention for him that, of course, goes horribly because, again, trying to implement, like, 21st century tactics of handling the human condition on mobsters is just hilarious, and you know will go wrong. But I find it really interesting how I feel like episode that directs of these television shows, you always get the characters at these very, very crucial, like, kind of turning points in their journeys, and this episode is no exception. Now, with Tyrion's struggle with this episode, Tyrion also, even though, once again, remaining the voice of reason here, kind of, you know, we have that big Lannister sit down with all those other Lannisters, and they're throwing all these suggestions, and Tywin is kind of ignoring them, and he's kind of being like, you know, they have my son, kind of just still processing the idea that his golden boy has actually, like, been captured, right? Because Tywin obviously values Jaime clearly over every other one of his children, and Tyrion obviously does this thing where he knocks the glass of wine on the floor and says, that right there is your piece. It disappeared the moment that Joffrey ordered Ned's head cut off, you know? And afterwards, Tywin has this moment where, for probably the only time in the entire series, Tywin acknowledges not only Tyrion's usefulness, but the fact that Tyrion actually, if given half a chance, could do some actual real good in this series and for the realm, you know? He makes it clear to him, it's like, you were right, I was wrong, I should have kind of listened to you as far as that goes. Now, before we might have had a chance to, you know, lessen and ease the tension. But now with Ned gone, things are continuing to spiral out of control, and I'm not going to be able to do what I can because I still have to fight this war out here in the Riverlands. So I need you to kind of take my place as far as, taking my place as the Hand of the King for the time being. And he essentially gifts Tyrion his position as Hand of the King to serve in his stead. Like he says, go to King's Landing, get Joffrey and Cersei under control, make sure that nothing else like this happens again. If you smell even a whiff of treachery. And the interesting thing about this is that not only is it an acknowledgement, obviously, of Tywin kind of acknowledging the son that for the longest time he's always kind of wished dead. He's made it very clear that he wants Tyrion dead multiple times throughout the series, but also it's kind of this meta acknowledgement of like, okay, now it's Tyrion's time to shine. Now he finally has this chance at real power that he kind of never would have had the opportunity to do so before. I always find it interesting how, right, we have the parallels between Jon and Daenerys, right, as time goes on, but then Tyrion is almost kind of serves as like this tertiary force between the two of them where he understands kind of both sides, but because he's several years older than them, he has kind of this wisdom and experience that none of the two of them really have because of the horrors and the experiences that he's had. But this is really still the first chance that he has to shine. So besides it being just beyond satisfying, like, what do you think as far as, like, Tyrion finally, having a chance to do some real good, and him essentially kind of being gifted as like the savior of the realm, where he's now gotta go and kind of fix essentially everything that his family has screwed up?
Well, I think season 1 did a great job with Tyrion. It's one of those things where like he's book smart. He's, wants to visit a lot of places. He goes up to the wall to do this sort of touristy thing where he's going to piss off the other side of it, and it's one of those things where, he's meeting people. He's understanding who the Lord Commander is and the Man of the One Night's Watch. He understands Jon Snow. He's a very student of people and understanding their psychology. And, when he's even captured and he sort of, decides to do the trial by combat, he controls that situation and understands the people involved enough that he could actually sort of get his way out of that situation, which he pretty much should have died in. And so his, arc in season 1 is really showing that he's an intelligent, capable leader. And then when he kind of confronts his father and eventually gets named Hand of the King, it's like, hey, Tywin doesn't really, I guess, trust him that much, but it's like, you seem to understand this. You seem to have like your finger on it. So go ahead. Like, you're going to go and you're going to be my Hand of the King. And I think this is sort of like a big test. It's like, are you a useful part of the family that we've never really, utilized before? And are you going to fail? And I think Tywin is doing this because he's sort of backed into that corner and has to do it. And it's like, well, Joffrey and Cersei aren't going to do it. So like, batters up, here, put the bat in your hand. Yep. And go out there and get this done.
Because Tywin, I think the other thing too, obviously, is subliminally, I think that even though Tywin knows that, like, if Tyrion screws up, like, that's it, they're done, and his whole thing is that he preaches his legacy. But Tywin also, I think, is subconsciously kind of hoping that Tyrion fails. And the whole thing is that he knows that Jaime's captured, Cersei and Joffrey just made a big mess of things in King's Landing. He knows he's got no other options as far as that goes. But subliminally, I think he's also like, yes, let's put it to the test. Let's see what Tyrion can do. But at the end of the day, he's also kind of hoping and wishing it's like, yeah, like, Tyrion's going to screw this up, and eventually I'm going to have to come in and kind of save everything. So either way it works, whether this is actually Tywin having some faith in Tyrion for once, or whether he's just kind of setting this up as this elaborate ploy to allow him to quite literally come in and save the day at the end of season 2, when him and when his forces and the newly allied Tyrell forces come in and save them from Stannis' forces ultimately. But either way, I think it's a matter of, definitely, you're right, Tywin is backed into a wall. He has no other choice. And again, it kind of results in Tyrion, for me, again, being the best that he's ever been, and finally having this chance at power, and also having this chance at kind of, making a name for himself that he really never did before. And so if season 1 is kind of all about setting him up as this intelligent, competent figure, then season 2 is kind of seeing what happens when he's actually given a chance to utilize those gifts. And again, for the most part, he does it pretty damn well. Again, so Peter Dinklage famously won the Emmy for supporting actor for his performance as Tyrion for this first season, and then would go on to win for seasons 5 and then the last 2 seasons. But personally, also, I think they kind of like did a disservice to him when they also didn't have him win for season 2, because there are points of his performance in season 2 that I think surpass his performance in this season. But it's still a very well earned Emmy.
I'm going to say like season 2 is the best at Tyrion, because for the most part, you know, you have Jon Arryn who is the Hand of the King, and he dies, you know, really before we understand what the role of the Hand of the King is. So we can't really judge, you know, his leadership or, you know, his position and how he handled it, other than the fact that he died. So I guess he didn't really handle it that well. And then you have Ned Stark, who went through this whole entire arc of not being able to handle it, not being able to understand who his real allies and who real foes were, and he fails miserably. And you know, season 1's all about setting Tyrion up as someone that can really, you know, own a room and control people and lead people. And now he's Hand of the King, and it's like, is he going to suffer the same fate as Ned Stark? Because you know, the past 2 hands have easily been dealt with and killed, and now Tyrion is faced with a challenge of, do I, you know, survive this position? Am I able to sort of get the power I need to be an effective Hand of the King? And that's really the ride that is set up for season 2. We're going to see all the little power things that he does behind the scenes, all the schemes, all the, you know, things that he does to rein Cersei in. And it's not just like, hey, you know, be a little more respectful. You know, Stannis is the right heir. You know, Tyrion plays the game and does it, you know, quite well in season 2.
Yeah, and Varys even comments, it's like, Ned Stark hated the game, and that's part of what got him killed, and refused to play it, and that's what got him killed. But you, not only are you play the game, not only are you good at it, but you enjoy it too. And Tyrion says, yeah, I kind of do. You know, even though he's kind of, again, he's further demoted and humiliated really after season 2. There's a reason why. Again, part of the reason why he's so good at it is because he knows he's good at it. And Daenerys brings up this point later on when he becomes her hand, which is that people like what they're good at, and Tyrion likes what he's good at, which is ruling and organizing people. And the fact that he's probably the only one who's able to do it in a way that's not too malicious and not too naive. He has just the right amount of foresight in order to be able to make the right decisions, but he's also got just good enough of a heart in order to kind of see the big picture, but also do what's best for everyone in the long run and not be cruel or malicious or naive to the point that it gets him killed, you know? So that, I feel like, is what sums up Tyrion so well and kind of sets him up for this next season. Now, for this next segment, I'm going to kind of mix everything. We're going to kind of mix the focus character with the final character arc.
Yeah, we got to talk about pretty much one more thing in this episode, right? Dom, and that's
your favorite part. Your favorite part of this entire season, which is Daenerys' arc and how that wraps up, where I know we talked about it a lot last episode. You had your problems with it. I definitely agree. There are a lot of elements that are kind of rushed in order to kind of make things happen.
Last episode, I compared Jason Momoa's, you know, performance in this final episode to Ben Stiller in Tropic Thunder.
Oh,
right?
man.
You know,
I mean,
that
that's a little bit of a stretch, but I get where you're coming from as far as that goes.
Yeah, well, he got too into the character. He went full comatose, you know, and it was basically just like, he was like planking and drooling and like I don't know how I feel about this whole storyline. Like the idea that, you know, he's cut and then a witch basically purposely infects the wound,
poisons him, and then does this crazy magic spell that renders him comatose but kills Dany's son in the same time. Like it's
okay, come on. Are you gonna like
of just setting things up for the sake of setting things up?
She's basically going to do some sort of spell that includes killing his horse, and because she said she could deliver children, you're gonna bring Dany into that tent, and she's going to be doing this weird horse murder sacrifice and midwife action at the same time. Like it's to me, whatever. The whole storyline doesn't make any sense, but it basically sets up Daenerys, and after this whole thing happens and she realizes Drogo is not going to be of any of use, her child is dead, it's like
Palisar's abandoned her.
Yeah, so what does she do next, you know? And this is where the fire part of the episode
Of the
name
fire and
comes
blood
into
part
play.
comes in, yeah.
So what takes place, Dom, and why do you actually think this is a great
Well,
setup
look,
for the next season?
I don't necessarily think that this is a great setup for the next season. I think it ends in one hell of a closing shot with obviously the scene of her walking into Drogo's funeral pyre with Mirri Maz tied to it, but kind of trusting in kind of the invulnerability that she has to fire that was kind of set up earlier in the season. And obviously when we see her at the end, we see that she's kind of solidified this loyalty to her, this undying loyalty from Jorah and the remaining Khalasar members that are left loyal to her with the birth of her 3 dragons. And she kind of uses this a lot in the later seasons as kind of an explanation as to why she deserves to be the rightful ruler. And I talked about this a lot on the last episode, right? But I wanted to talk about it more here, which is this idea that even though Dany, ultimately, we're rooting for her because of the things that she does and because she has this big gusto message of, yes, we're going to free everyone. We're going to end tyranny. We're going to break the wheel. We're going to end it all systems. Not only is the fact that that's not feasible at all because just of the inherent, the nature of the beast whole thing as far as people goes, but the other thing, too, is that as far as I'm concerned, again, I talked about this a lot last episode, the seeds of her going crazy are planted right here, where she's mad at Mirri Maz, and Mirri Maz is bringing up legitimate points to why she had no intention of keeping Drogo around for any reason at all, and for killing Daenerys' baby. She even says it as like, your baby would have been the stallion that mounted the wind. How many lives have I saved, essentially, by killing him? Kind of as an interesting little throwback to the whole thing of Grand Maester Pycelle trying to make the argument, back when Robert was arguing for Daenerys' death about how many lives will be spared, obviously, if we end her now, as opposed to, if she crosses the narrow sea with several thousand Dothraki screamers later. And we kind of see the result of that when she comes to Westeros, right? And she starts off trying to play it cool, trying to play it calm, trying to play it rational, and then eventually gives into her greater Targaryen impulses, right? We're not going to talk a whole lot about the Targaryens, but the whole thing, right, that's brought up later on, that kind of factors not only into the Targaryens and their whole dynasty, but also for the Lannisters as well, and kind of the reason why Cersei and Jaime's kids don't end up necessarily having the best of fates, which is that every time a Targaryen was born, the gods flipped a coin. But the reason why that was made a thing was because literally the Targaryens wed brother and sister, and they did the whole pure line, literally keeping it within the family, kind of thing that we know kind of results in a lot of genetic abnormalities. And as a result, we kind of saw, again, the Targaryens, when they were ruling Westeros, it was either they were the best rulers or the worst. You either had a Baelor the Blessed or you had a Mycor the Cruel. You either had an Aegon the Conqueror or you had an Aerys the Mad King. There was never a Targaryen that was ever kind of in the middle. And again, part of, I think, the crucial part of Dany's arc that, again, they missed. They had the pieces all there, but they missed with those last 2 seasons was the idea that Dany was trying to be the first Targaryen that didn't subscribe to that belief, but ultimately at the end of the day, she gave in to her deeper Targaryen urges. And I still stand by the fact that I definitely think that that's where they were going with the books. And I definitely think that, again, had it been handled more properly and had they had more time to flesh it out, it could have resulted in something really interesting, kind of seeing Daenerys grapple with all this, because that whole part of her characteristic is set up heavily once she conquers the slave cities and decides to stay there and rule. The whole part of why her arc in A Dance of Dragons, the book, is so compelling is because she has this constant push, pull, back and forth, somebody telling her to do one thing, somebody telling her to do another thing, and it seems like everything that she tries just results in failure. And so you even have that moment where Olenna tells her at the end of season 7, it's like, your Aegon the Conqueror didn't conquer Westeros by being nice to everyone. He conquered it with fire and blood. She's like, you're a dragon. Be a dragon. And that's kind of, again, it's summed up again, I think, in the title of this episode, where at the end she emerges as kind of almost like this Messiah-like figure, but ultimately to what end? I think it's actually kind of ingenious how Martin set that up, where she's hailed as the Messiah, but ends up kind of being this almost devil of sorts that brings all this destruction with her, at the behest of doing things for the greater good.
Well, I think, again, like most characters in this first season, apparently she's traumatized, several times.
Going trend, specifically with the female characters this season.
Yeah, apparently, like the whole thing sums up the reason why the kingdoms can't get along is trauma. But for the most part, talking to your point of her being crazy, it's like she's walking into a funeral pyre. Like, yeah, she understands
that's not normal.
Yeah, she can't get burned and whatnot, so you understand that there's something, I guess, magical about her, and she walks into it and, basically emerges with the 3 dragons, baby dragons. It's one of those things where, like, there's no turning back, it's like you're a different person at this point, and that's really the setup here is getting rid of every element or most of the elements of season one, which is the Khalasar and Khal Drogo and, the fact that she was this great Khaleesi. Now it's like she has the devoted people that basically see the end result of this funeral pyre and dragons. So she has like the true believers, and she's going to go to the next sort of place in season two and try to figure out how to get from her new rock bottom and grow her back up into a position of power. And this is going to be sort of a constant thing for Daenerys for a while. Is every single new place that she goes doesn't quite work out the way as expected.
Yep.
And how does that sort of make her stronger? How does that bring her to be a more effective ruler? How does this bring her to power to the point where she's able to get over to Westeros and start, playing the Game of Thrones and enter that sort of realm?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a thing that it will be, I think, of very big interest to us as we continue to cover her arc throughout the next couple seasons, and kind of, where the things start to go wrong. Because I think a lot of the things that happened that kind of caused her arc to go wrong, I think started early on in the show. Because obviously the whole thing is, she has, after, right, obviously this initial tragedy, right, with losing kind of all of Drogo's forces, right, she kind of spends a season wavering around in Karth, where even though that seems like a kind of a non-consequential storyline for her, I know a lot of people complain about the Karth storyline for her in season 2. She does ultimately learn a lot kind of about the people who she thinks are loyal to her versus the people who are just kind of playing her, and she kind of learns those necessary lessons early on, which leads her to obviously kind of have this awesome upward trajectory of conquering the slave cities, and then she learns, okay, now I actually have to learn how to rule, and she discovers that it's not as easy as it looks. So
yeah, I would say, Dom, like having season 2 spoiler if you haven't seen it, but too bad this is a show where we talk about the whole series.
Yep.
Season 2, the dragons get ripped away from her.
Yeah.
So it's like a mother having her children taken, and it's one of those things where it's more trauma added to the pile. So it's like ultimately. I remember correctly that, because obviously she has the dragons towards the end of the series, but she gets her dragons back, but the damage is sort of also added to the psyche. It's like at any moment someone could take these dragons away from me. And, it's that's something that remains as one of the lessons that remains in the back of her mind all the way to the end of the series.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are like a lot of other ancillary characters that come in the books that kind of serve to reinforce that. Like, it's interesting, obviously, how they utilize the dragons going forward, obviously, with the show. Obviously, because, they're limited budget and they can only do certain things. And it's still amazing to me, kind of the growth, obviously, not just of the characters, but of the CG. And the CG starts off and they think those things look like little runty CG creatures that you've seen in a million things before. And as they grow more and more and more and more until they're like these full-fledged gigantic beasts of destruction, it amazes me kind of the visual effects. Like, say what you will about those last 2 seasons, but the visual effects were definitely on point as far as that goes. But with that being said, man, that's pretty much it for season 1. The only thing that I wanted to kind of rattle off is I wanted to do a final rest in peace for all the characters that we lost this season, all of the major and the minor ones that we lost. Obviously, again, major main character deaths, like main cast member lists that we saw die.
Like the stable boy?
Yes.
That was killed by Needle?
R.I.P. the stable boy, but no, we have
at least that was the first victim of Needle. We get to see it up front and personally,
So we have the death of Viserys in episode 6, A Golden Crown. We have the death of Robert Baratheon in episode 7, You Win or You Die. We have obviously the famous death of Ned Stark in the previous episode 9, Baelor, and this episode we have the death of Khal Drogo, Jason Momoa. In this episode, R.I.P. to all those other major characters, and R.I.P. to all the other guys, the 3 Night's Watch members that died in the first episode: Jon Arryn, the Assassin, Lady Sanders Direwolf, Micah the Butcher's Boy, Sir Hugh of the Vale, Sir Gregor's Horse, Jory Cassell, and all the rest of Ned's guards that perish in King's Landing. The 3 wildlings who attempt to abduct Bran, Sir Vardis Egan, Daenerys' attempted assassin in episode 7, Septim Ordain, Syrio Farrell, the stable boy, the 2 white corpses that Jon kills, Mago, who's the Dothraki that Drogo kills in that one-on-one fight where he gets the wound in episode 8, Kotho, and Miri Mazdur. R.I.P. to all of those characters. I wish I could say we missed you, but honestly, it's just impressive that I was able to keep track of all those deaths. Let's be completely honest here.
Yeah, hey, listen, that's a lot of folks.
It is a lot of folks
just got a shout out for their role in the first season of Game of Thrones.
Of course, and the death count is only gonna keep going up as we continue to break down this show as it keeps going on, people. So once again, we pre-recorded this episode. Next week we will be taking a break, obviously, for certain things that are going on. A certain thing that we're recording that's going to come later on for the channel that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. It's something completely different that we've never done before on the channel. But we will be back in 2 weeks for the premiere season 2, episode 1, The North Remembers, on 2 Sundays from now. That's right. So next Sunday, you guys have off. Take a break. 2 Sundays from now, we will officially be back to begin season 2, which is ultimately one of the best seasons. Pat, I wanted to thank you again for being here with me every step of this journey of Ice and Fire, and I can't wait to discuss this show further with you as we continue to go along. Where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Hey, Dom, thanks for having me. I didn't know what to expect when you said, hey, you want to watch Game of Thrones again? I was like, oh, I think I'm past that, but hey, I'll give it a try. I remember that being a good show, and I'm glad I'm sort of watching it, glad I'm talking to you about it. You know, it's definitely a good refresher to go through such a good show again. And, you know, hey, catch me on Instagram at Patrick W. Huber, and here on the Talkin TV YouTube channel or podcast. You know, I'm basically Talkin Thrones, and hopefully you enjoy the conversations.
Absolutely. And you can, of course, find me on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV or at Talkin TV Podcast, where I post every single day about all the stuff that is going on the channel. You can also follow my personal page at Movie Nerd Reviews, all one word. And, of course, be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to it, and leave a comment section below. What did you guys think of our first full season of Talkin Thrones? What are you looking forward to the most overall? Where would you kind of rank the episodes of season 1? Where do you think season 1 ranks in the overall canon? All of those questions and more, leave them in the comments section below. Thank you guys once again for being so attuned to each of these episodes. We've only gotten more to come. 10 episodes down. We've got 63 episodes left to go, and we are just getting started. So we will see you guys in 2 weeks for the official finale. For the official premiere of season 2 of Talkin Thrones. And as always, people, remember, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies and TV.
Eat more barbecue and roasted vegetables,
and eat more barbecue,
maybe some fireworks. You know, if you can legally do that.
We'll see you guys next time.